Hi, it's Miss Pitzel at the Upton West Library, and I'm book talking another nonfiction history book. It's called The Port Chicago 50, and it's by one of my favorite nonfiction authors, Steve Sheinkin. Okay, so I've known about this book for a while. It's kind of been on my reading list, but what prompted it is these people were recently, 80 years after the fact, and all of them are dead, were exonerated of their crimes. Okay. So this happened during World War II. They were sailors in the U.S. Navy, which was one of the two branches that were actually accepting African-American soldiers, but they didn't always tell these people they didn't have a choice about what assignments they would get. Not that everybody does, but like they were going to get all the grunt work. And that everything in the Navy was segregated at the time. So it kind of focuses on Joseph Smith, who was considered a leader among this group of African Americans. And what happened, it's also about a disaster. So it's a disaster that also dealt with segregation and the civil rights movement. So it's just a really interesting story. And like I said, I just, within the last 2 weeks of me reading this book, I saw something about 80 years after the fact, they're exonerated. So, all right, it was on July 17th of 1944. These people, the blacks, were doing munitions work. So they were in Port Chicago, which is near San Francisco, and the blacks were loading munitions onto ships for the Navy. So it's a really important job, but we're dealing with bombs and other high explosive things. They were given no training as to how to handle these, and they were had white officers in charge of them, who often also had little or no training. And then the officers also would bet on which crew could be the fastest, which is not the best thing for things to happen. Well, disaster struck, and during one of the shifts, there was a huge explosion that literally destroyed 2 ships that were at the pier, the entire pier itself, 300 plus people who were at the pier. It damaged and destroyed a lot of buildings and injured a lot of people on the Port Chicago base, but also within the town. Like, it blew out windows for within a mile, and like the barracks that many of these people who were not on shift were in literally the building ended up falling down. But first it broke out the glass, so a lot of them were injured that way. So when it comes time, they end up moving these soldiers to a different location where there's also munitions loading up ships, and these soldiers don't really know that they're going to do this. That's their contention, and they are told to take a left turn instead of a right turn, and a bunch of them stop. So there's over 300 of them, and they stop and they say, we're not going to do that again, not unless things change. And they're like, we are willing to fight, we're just disobeying this order, we don't want to do this unless things change, but we'll go fight in combat. But they weren't allowed to go fight in combat. So eventually they put all of them in they put them all on a barge, but it's basically like a jail. It's not great conditions, and that scares a lot of them into backing out. And so of the 300 plus, only 50 end up saying, we are not going back to do this. We will do any other job you tell us to do, but we're not going back to do this. And those people, 50, the Port Chicago 50, are put on trial, a military tribunal. So you have to understand, military is different. Like Thurgood Marshall, who was a civil rights lawyer at the time, is watching this case, but he can't be their advocate. He can't be their lawyer. It's got to be a military lawyer. So shockingly, they're all found guilty, despite the fact that mutiny has some very specific measures, which, yeah. So even later on, the Navy even looks at, there was some misconduct on the part of the prosecutor that shouldn't have been accepted, but the guys end up in jail. Thurgood Marshall, like I said, civil rights lawyer, eventual Supreme Court justice, working for the NAACP, says, I'm still working your case. And then after the war ends, these men are quietly released from jail and put back into the active Navy on ships. So during the trial of these guys, the Secretary of the Navy is segregation is bad. That's part of the reason why this whole thing happened. And even though he kind of like knows what's going to happen to these guys, they actually start to experiment with desegregation or integration on ships to see how it works. Shockingly, it's a success. And Franklin Roosevelt's son was one of the captains of the ships who said, yeah, this is working just fine. At first there was some nervousness, but it worked out just fine. So, like I said, this fascinating story of a disaster during World War II, that was part of the problem, is that disobeying an order during wartime was really, yeah. They made an example of these people. So the fact that they were put back on they were put on ships, which is where they wanted to be to begin with, but they still had this conviction on their record. So we'll take you out of prison after only like 16 months and put you on a ship, but we won't exonerate you of the crime. So like I said, 80 years later, after they've all died, they've now been exonerated, which is not in the book because it just happened. All right, highly, highly recommend this book. It was just a fascinating read. All right, if nonfiction is not your cup of tea, it's not always mine, I will help you find something else. Have a fantastic day and keep on reading.